Welcome, everyone, to this launch of the Responsible Agricultural Investment, RAI Tool for Agribusiness, that we at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, have been developing and testing together with Ceres plus SPTF and a range of other partners, many of whom are joining us today. My name is Sean Wolfrey, and I lead a work stream at IISD on sustainable agriculture and food systems. And a big part of our work involves supporting stakeholders from government officials to civil society actors to private sector actors to put principles of responsible investment in agriculture and food systems, RAI, into practice. So we're really excited today to be introducing this tool to you, and I hope to be stimulating a really good discussion on how we can promote the uptake of this tool and complementary resources to advance responsible private sector investment in agriculture and food systems around the world. Now, the plan for our session today is to introduce the tool to you through a series of brief presentations from those who've been involved in the development and testing of the tool. We'll then have a brief opportunity to address any questions that you as participants may have about the tool, its development, how it works, who it's for. And please, in that regard, do make use of the chat box. If you have questions while the presenters are speaking, feel free to pop them into the chat box. We will be monitoring and picking up on those questions, so I encourage you to use it. And for those who can, obviously, there is also the function to raise your hand if you have a question, and we will collect those as well. And after we've had some question and answers for clarification about the tool and its development, we'd also really like to expand the discussion and have a broader interactive exchange with all of you about the tool to get your thoughts on it, your feedback, but in particular, your thoughts and feedback on how we can really encourage the use of this tool. Because obviously, as with any tool, it's only as useful as it can be if it's being used by those who we want it to be used by. I should mention that we are recording the session today, and we do plan to make that recording available for those who are not able to attend today. And I would also appreciate it if, when you log out of the call today, you will get a short survey. We'd really greatly appreciate it if you could complete that survey for us. It really does help us in terms of our work going forward. Now, before I hand over to my colleague Hafiz, who's been very involved in the development of the tool, I just want to also acknowledge the role of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation and the support they have provided for the development of the tool, without whom I think it would have been impossible to do the work that we've done and put into its development. Now, with that, I would like to hand over to Hafiz to introduce the presentations part of the session today. Hafiz, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Hello, everybody. I think I know most of you one way or another. Just to say, my main role today is actually to introduce the session with a set of with a presentation with a set of issues and so on. But then following me, we'll have three other presenters: Darryl, Vhugen, who's based over in Seattle. I'll say a few more words about him and the others towards the end of my presentation. Marrion, Allet, who's been very much involved in putting this whole project together, in developing the tool. And Duncan, Duncan Pringle, who's been involved in actually doing a lot of the field work with regard to testing the tool in the field with agribusiness. So that's the backdrop. And so, given that we don't have so much time, I'm going to sort of launch straight into my presentation, which I said to set the scene. Then we can move on to the other presentations. So, Maria, if you kindly sort of share the first presentation, would be great. Great. So as I said, what I want to do is just set the scene, and there are four main messages I want to get across. The first is just a bit of background, a bit of prehistory almost, about the development of RAI and why responsible agricultural investment is so important, and particularly why the CFSR is so important for the work that we're doing. Secondly, I want to say a few words about the tool, just in terms of what it is and what it is not. The main technical part of the tool will be introduced more by Marrion a bit later on in today's presentations, but just to give you an idea of where we stand with this. The third point, the third message I want to get across is simply that actually this work was not possible without lot of partnership, with working very closely with a whole range of other actors in the field. And I want to say a few words about the partnership, and also not just in terms of developing the tool and testing it, but also in terms of some of the other products which are resulted as a result of this. And the final slide will simply be about how these partnerships are much wider. And one of the main things that we're trying to do as a sort of coalition, so to speak, is to try to create or produce a suite of tools that actually work for a whole range of different actors, all to the right, which are basically coherent and cohesive in terms of actually their use. So I'll come back to all those points in a moment. Let me start first with the first slide. So thanks, Maria. So the first point is just to remind us that actually the food crisis, as we know it today, began in the late 2000s. It led to a huge rise in investment, both financial investment, agribusiness investment, and investment by both domestic and foreign enterprises, especially in developing countries, but of course in other countries too. That's fine. Those are great things, because for a long time there had been much investment in agriculture or in agribusiness at all. But of course, the huge increase led to a number of issues which were of big concern, especially on how these investments were impacting the vulnerable, smallholders, communities, local economies, farmers, and so on. Again, I don't want to dwell on this because I think most are familiar with this, but just to say that all of us, we mobilized to act on this, the private sector, the public sector, international organizations, we mobilized, we did research, we got involved in action, we created various tools and so on and so forth, which is great, all excellent work. But one of the biggest issues with this was actually that we had at that point in the early 2010s, a proliferation of principles, guidelines, frameworks, tools, which were excellent. They actually worked for their particular purpose, but they did not necessarily mesh with each other. So as a result of that, the Committee for Food Security, or the Committee on World Food Security at Rome, which is of course representative of all of the member countries and in fact the private sector as well, and civil society, put together a set of principles for responsible investment in agricultural food systems, which we today call CFS-RAI. The great thing about this was actually this created a global and comprehensive mandate on responsible agriculture investment, which allowed us all to focus on the same set of issues which we use in all of our work. It was tested in a number of different ways with lots of agencies, with the governments, with the private sector, and so on. So actually, it did have a very, very comprehensive mandate. So a landmark development for us. And just to jump very fast to the next stage, we should say, as a result of this, we have been able to create policies, guidelines, tools, and so on, building on the CFS-RAI, building on the Committee for Food Security, Responsible Agricultural Investment Principles, to have a common framework, or we try to have a common framework. And most importantly, the sort of work that we're doing, that Ceres plus the PF is doing, is to try to create a coherent set of tools which work for the public sector, agribusiness, financial investors, civil society, and others. I mean, it's not just us. There's a lot of people actually out there trying to do this. And one of the biggest issues remains how to bring all this together into one cohesive framework. But let's move on to the next slide. Next slide, please, Maria. Next slide, please. Can we go back one, please, Maria? That's it. That's great. Thank you very much. So what is the tool for? And clearly it's in the name. It's a RAI tool for agribusiness. It allows us to actually assess the degree to which agribusiness are aligned with the CFS-RAI, with the RAI overall, and it allows them to determine how to actually act in terms of improving the alignment with the RAI, and to become much more responsible, much more focusing on high standards of social business conduct. That's basically what it's about, and it's fairly straightforward. It's a part of a suite of tools, and the way we developed it, that say Ceres plus CPTF, SPTF, and ourselves, was to structure the tool around business operation and dimensions. In other words, strategy, human resources, production, distribution, the sort of language that business understands. And the reason for that is simply that the CFS-RAI, indeed, all RAI principles, all RAI guidelines, tend to be very high level. They speak to government, they speak to business, they speak to others. And you need to translate that language into one which is intelligible by all of these different actors. So one of the biggest things that we're doing is translate that into something that actually works. And as I said, we did this for agribusiness. We'll come back a bit more to that development in Marrion's presentation later on. But what I want to also say is that what it is not for, it is not intended to replace existing tools. There are plenty of tools out there being used by the public sector, the private sector, by different sectors, for example, the palm oil industry or the sugar industry and so on. We do not want to reinvent the wheel. This is simply a way of actually bringing all these issues together. And for example, if in one sector, an agribusiness is already doing or conducting the right practices, which makes sense from the point of the CFS RAI, in the content of the tool, they simply state this, and actually is sufficient evidence to show that they are acting in a way which is compliant with the RAI. But Marrion will go into all those sort of details later on. But basically what I'm saying is we are not trying to replace tools, we're simply trying to bring a cohesive framework together to look at the issues of RAI. So we move on to the next slide, please, Maria. Then I want to just say a few words about the fact that this whole process being very much based on support from not just ourselves in the sense of 3+CFTF and us at ISD, but also from other partners. And in terms of the actual testing of the tool, some of the key partners that we relied upon were Ada Snoop in the orange on the top or the middle left, Bamboo Capital, which links to the ABC fund, which is the IFAD fund for investing in agriculture, and GrowAsia. And with these guys, we're able to sort of not just to create the tool in terms of the underlying mechanical development of the tool, but also test it. And one of the benefits of this connection was that through Snoop, we were able to link in with investment, financial investors, the same with Bamboo Capital, the same with GrowAsia, actually are already investing in the field, and their investments are going to agribusinesses. So through there, we've been able to access a number of different agribusinesses with whom we actually test the tool. And again, Duncan will come back to this, but basically, we're able to use a tool, we're able to use it with agribusinesses in a number of different countries in Africa and in Asia. And as a result, we've been able to refine the tool much further. I think today, in fact, from day one, it seemed to work very well, but today it's actually a much better tool as a result of this process. I should also say, but Sri's plus FCF, or rather Marrion will later on explain that we had a lot of other partners who actually sort of test the tool on our behalf as well, and she will actually sort of enumerate them as well in her presentation. But so the first thing to say is simply that the Sri's plus FTF has developed the underlying tool. We're able to test the tool using agribusinesses which were supplied to us or provided to us as options, but through investors who actually were working through Snoop, Bamboo Capital, and GrowAsia. And as a sort of side development, we were able to use as part of the overall methodology, we were able to use the material that we produce from those testing as a basis for creating a set of case studies, the RAI case studies, which we will, well, rather Ada will have to create or set up a launch sometime in September. We'll come back to this later on. I don't really want to go to those now. And on the bottom right, or if there's reference to the ASEAN RAI program, which is a program which is being run by GrowAsia, ourselves, FAO, ASEAN, and so on, ASEAN, and so on, which is trying to implement the ASEAN RAI guidelines in Southeast Asia, and which we are able to actually then learn from some of the development that we've had. But I'll let Borge, hopefully she'll come on later on, say a few words about that program, but just to say that program is based on the ASEAN RAI guidelines, which are part and parcel of our development of different RAI guidelines based on the CFS RAI. So there's cohesion all the way through the process. So finally, the last slide. So the bigger picture is this, that we've created the agribusiness tool. We work with partners to actually make sure it's better. We refined it. But I think the bigger picture is also that we want to try and develop a set of tools which are coherent and useful for all partners who are working in the RAI area. There are different ways of cutting the cake, and what I want to do is simply take it in this slide from the point of view of the life cycle of an agribusiness. So if you focus on the middle column, At the very center, you have the agribusiness operations. Basically, this is any agribusiness operating in any country, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia in our case. They might be doing production in the sense of farming, plantations, maybe processing in terms of manufacturing, maybe trading. The tool applies to all of them. And again, Marrion will say more about this. But actually, the point is, while our tool is actually focused on companies actually in operation, how can they improve things, it's also the case actually there's life cycles. So on the left of that middle diagram, refers to agribusiness decisions to invest. So before the investment begins, of course, there's a decision about where to invest, how to invest, what to invest in, what sort of choices to make. And working with FAO, ISD is also trying to create a tool for the private sector, which allows companies to actually determine to what extent the investment will be RAI compliant before the investment is actually made, before they actually set up operations. And I think this is a very important thing to do in advance before the agribusiness business operations commence. And on the right of that diagram, we have agribusiness decisions to exit. Exit, of course, is something which is important, which we all talk about. And in fact, we've done nothing so much so far about it. But I think it's also an issue to consider. What sort of tool might there be, might we want to develop, which would help agribusiness to exit in a way which actually is least problematic from the point of view of vulnerable communities and the like, from the point of responsible agricultural investment. But anyway, that's for the future. But basically, just to make the point that we actually have a tool now which has been developed with the FAO on screening pre-investment, ex-ante proposals to invest in developing countries. And Darryl will say a few words about that in a few moments. At the bottom of this diagram is a point that actually, although the private sector actually invests, although agribusinesses actually invest in countries, in different sectors and so on, you do need to have the right underlying policies, frameworks, legal framework and so on for this to occur. That's where the country comes in. And so just to say that also there is some work in that respect. So for instance, on the left-hand side, alongside the development of a screening tool for ex-ante decisions to invest, we also have or rather, well, I should say the FAO and the CCCSI had developed a tool to actually screen those investment proposals by the private sector, but on behalf of the government, to make sure that from the public standpoint perspective, for the civil side perspective, that these investments are going to be appropriate and compliant with RAI. And of course, they might feed into decisions on how to actually change those investments. And then in the middle and bottom, I've got things along the lines of, for example, alignment of country policies, laws, and institutions with RAI. And just to say, ISD has already developed a tool of this sort, applicable only at this stage in Southeast Asia, but actually fairly easily sort of generalizable for other regions, other countries too. Now, I'll stop there because there's a lot more to say here, but just to say at the very top, I've mentioned S3s plus SPTF tools which exist, which are financial sector, impact investors and others. These are wider than just RAI, wider than just agribusiness. But again, there's ways we can actually adapt them to make them more useful for RAI. So I won't go into more because I know we have limited time. But let me move on to the last slide. Thanks, Maria. And just to say, on the right-hand side, there's a picture of the responsible agricultural investment tool for agribusiness. The picture is actually of the guidance document we actually have, which is available to all of you and to others. Along with this document, we also have two other documents. One actually is the tool itself, which is an Excel sheet which we downloaded and used in terms of an agribusiness or others who actually want to see agribusiness investments in the area. And also there's a report template which allows any information gathered from the working document, the RAI tool, to be actually presented in a form that allows decisions to be made. But again, I think Marrion will say a few words about that. So just to say, the people who will be doing the hard work in terms of the presentations are Darryl, Vhugen, Marrion, Allet, and Duncan Pringle. We will start with Darryl Vhugen because we want to introduce simply the notion of actually another set of tools, another tool which actually is useful in this field. And he will say a few words, very few, on the early stage speed tool for responsible agribusiness investments I've referred to. And this is really just a little teaser because there will be a launch of this tool later on as well. Marrion Allet will say a few words about, or more than a few words, ideally, about the RAI Tool for agribusiness. But in terms of actual technical detail, the structured content of the tools, that should be after Darryl. And then Duncan Pringle, you see of course, the background details on the left. Duncan Pringle will actually say a few words about actually using the RAI Tool for agribusiness in practice. He was our man on the ground, actually testing the tool with other colleagues. He worked obviously closely with agribusinesses that were part of the process, and also with other stakeholders. So obviously, in the fieldwork, he spoke to farmers, communities, women farmers, young people, and so on as well. So he can say a few more words about how it actually feels like actually using the tool and how to use it in practice for yourself, whether you're an agribusiness or a financial investor or others. So I think I'll stop there now. If that's okay, Sean, and I'll move over to who's that? Darryl.
Thank you very much. Let's see, there's my video. Thank you very much, Hafiz. I noticed that he made a point of saying that I would say a very few words about this the early stage screening tool. Hafiz is familiar with the fact that, you know, unleashed, I might go on and on. But in any event, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of you, depending on where you are. I'm in Seattle. It's about 6:25 in the morning. So if I start mumbling, it's because it's a little bit too early for me. As Hafiz said, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to talk about the early stage screening tool that he referenced in that big picture slide a few moments ago. So again, this, as he alluded to, this is 3-4 years ago, FAO, IISD, and CCSI, and sort of me as working with all of them, got together and said, after doing some consultations and reaching out to people, said, look, looks like there's a need for a couple of new tools here. One, the sort of the screening tool for government institutions that Hafiz referenced, and which we're not going to get into today. And the other was an early stage due diligence tool for agribusinesses, so that very early on in the process of considering a new investment, they can look at it and ask themselves, to what extent is this potential investment likely to be aligned with the CFS RAI? So for the past few years, we've been working on putting this thing together. The current version of it, and I'll show you a little sample of it in a moment, is really designed for kind of a wide range of companies, domestic and international. Technically speaking, all size companies, although I think ultimately we're going to need to come up with something that is perhaps a little bit less complex, and for smaller companies that don't have the human resource or financial resource capacity to do a more extensive due diligence process. Greenfield and brownfield scenarios alike. And I hope different commodities, different value chain segments. Why early stage? Well, as Hafiz suggested, and let's give companies the opportunity to take a look at these issues early on, so that later, when they're using something like the RAI scoring tool that Hafiz talked about, and you know, which you'll hear more about in a moment, they get a good score. Basically, how are we doing as it relates to these issues, and also, is there a way, if we go ahead and do these this early stage due diligence, can we save ourselves a lot of money because we've identified and avoided issues that may come up later? Next, please. So what is the structure of this tool? Essentially, it starts out with some introductory information and, of course, some instructions on how to use the tool. But the essence of it then, part one asks the investor to provide information on the company itself, its experience, its capabilities. and needless to say, the company already knows who it is and what it has done. But keep in mind that one of the other reasons for completing this type of exercise is that if the company is looking for some sort of investment incentives or approval from a government agency, the government agency, the investment promotion agency usually, is going to be asking a lot of questions about, well, who are you? What have you done? What are your financial capabilities and so forth? So part one starts with some basic information about the company itself, and then it goes on to request details about the proposed investment. What is it you're trying to do? Where do you want to do it? What sort of relationships are you likely to have with local stakeholders? Are you a plantation, and are you going to engage with local farmers? What sort of employment do you anticipate? What sort of economic and environmental issues may arise, etc. Again, I think this can help the company to sort of organize its thinking about the kinds of issues that it needs to deal with as they relate to RAI, but also will help the company assemble the information it may need for the government IPA. Then part two sort of builds on what's in part one and asks a long series of questions related to each of the 10 CFS RAI principles. It's essentially asking the company to answer these questions and be thinking about it in terms of risk. And we tried to use a fairly simple red, yellow, green approach, with red being high risk, yellow being medium risk, and green being minimal or no risk at all. We provide advice as to specific actions to take if the risk level is either red or yellow, and then also identify some red flags. And as I said, in a moment, I'll show you a slide that will help you understand a little bit more about how we plan to do this. Part three then provides links to supplemental guidance. If you need to know more about issues related to, say, food security and nutrition, or land rights, or whatever it might be, here are some links to information that you can go to and that you can read. Next, please. Okay, so this gives you an idea of what part two looks like. So left-hand column identifies the relevant CFS RAI principle. Then we have a series of questions that the investor should answer. So for example, the first one there, could the project cause existing food cropland to be converted to the production of cash crops? Obviously, that's potentially a big issue as it relates to local food security. Red, green, yellow, what's the risk level? The third column is where the investor is asked to write a short statement of explaining the basis for the determination of risk. The next column provides an action. And you'll note in this case here, what I've shown you, mostly what we're telling them to do under the circumstances is conduct a food security analysis. Because remember, this is very early stage. So a lot of times the advice is, it looks like there's a potential problem here, so you better go out and do more work on determining if in fact the risk is as significant as you think it might be. And if so, then you need to look at redesigning the project to avoid the risk. We also, in the far right column, have a series of red flags related to each of the RAI principles that essentially are saying, if this risk is so serious that if you can't mitigate it or avoid it, you ought to move on to another project. Next, please. So again, where we stand right now is we're working on creating a more user-friendly format for the tool. Ideally, we'd like it to be something where people can fill it in on using a smartphone or a tablet. So if they're out in the field working on this, they can do this and not be too worried about having a big laptop with them. We want to pilot the tool with some actual agribusiness project proposals. We're actually, frankly, looking for some funding to help support that. And so we hope to do a rollout of this in the fall, potentially at the CFS RAI in Rome. And so stay tuned for that. I'll be happy later on to answer any questions you might have, but for now, I will turn it back over to Hafiz. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thanks, Darryl. But I think we're actually sort of running out of time, so I'm going to sort of move on right away to Marrion, who will actually give us the nitty-gritty of how the tool works.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hafiz. Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm going to introduce a bit more concretely what the RAI tool is, exactly what it is about. So my name is Marrion Allet. I work for Cerise plus SPTF. Cerise plus SPTF is a joint venture of organizations that have been leaders in social and environmental performance management, especially in the inclusive finance sector, but also working on the agricultural sector. And I make this quick presentation because it will help understanding the approach we had in developing this RAI tool. Maria, if you can go next, please. So this RAI tool, as we said, it's a very concrete tool to promote responsible business practices within agribusinesses. So when we talk about agribusinesses, here more specifically, when we developed this tool, we've decided to focus on agribusinesses involved in production, processing, or trading of agricultural and food products. And we look more specifically at agribusinesses that are directly working with smallholder farmers or that have also direct impact on local communities. You can go next, please. As you see in my slide, I'm really insisting that this tool is actually a management tool. That's really the approach we have within Cerise plus SPTF. We don't want to be developing just tools that will be only for scoring, giving a specific score and that's it. We want those tools to really help the users, and in that case, the agribusinesses, to be able to improve their practices. So the tool is a first step where they are able, thanks to it, to assess their performance, and they can identify their strengths and their weaknesses. Once they know the gaps, they know what areas they need to improve, then they can work on defining an action plan, identifying priorities, and trying to define, the time frame, the resources they will need to improve those practices. So that's why, as Hafiz mentioned, we tried within the tool to be very specific in detailing exactly the management practices that they can implement in order to align with different standards in terms of responsible business practices. We can go next, please. So this tool can be used but in particular by the agribusinesses themselves. They can use the tool to conduct a self-assessment and then see how they can improve their practices. But it can also be used by financial investors if they want to make a due diligence, on the responsible business practices of agribusinesses before investing. They could use the tool or a selection of indicators from that tool. But it can also be a reference or a source of inspiration for industry associations, technical assistance providers, or regulators, public agencies, other organizations that may refer to the tool to maybe build some training programs they have or promote those responsible business conduct, responsible practices within the sector. So that's a tool that can have different purposes, different ways of being used, I would say. We can move next. Yeah, thanks. The tool was built first trying to translate the principles for responsible investment in agriculture and food systems into practices. But we looked also at other frameworks in terms of standards. And in particular, we tried to align the tool, the RAI tool, to the IFC performance standards. We also looked at some outcomes, impact metrics that have been developed by CSAF. We looked, of course, at the ASEAN RAI principles. We also aligned the different indicators and practices with the SDGs. We looked at indicators also or practices that have been promoted in the fair trade by fair trade actors, and we try to align to IRIS Plus. So those are just examples, but that's what we try to do in this work we conducted together with Hafiz and his team, trying to go also beyond the CFS RAI principles and encompass other frameworks that can be used as references for the sector. And in terms of the spirit in which the tool was developed, it's very much in line with the work that CERIS plus SPTF has been conducting in the past 20 years on building those universal standards for social and environmental performance management. That's something we have done for the inclusive finance sector. And it's really in the same mindset and building on the experience we had on the inclusive finance sector that we built this RAI tool here. So trying to have very concrete management practices within the tool. We can move next. So very concretely, the RAI tool has 5 sections. There's first an ID card to have very basic information on the agribusiness profile. We have included then some scoping questions because a specificity in the agricultural sector is that there's a great diversity of agribusinesses in terms of size, of types of products, the role in the value chain they can have. So we have a few questions here that are used to adjust the indicators to the agribusiness profile. So by filtering out indicators that would not be relevant to specific profiles. The core of the tool is what we call the practice section. That's where we are looking at the operations, the practices, and the procedures along 7 dimensions that I'm going to present just after. Then we have a section that is more looking at outcomes, so where we propose a set of outputs and outcomes indicators that are aligned with CSAF impact metrics. For now, this is still a bit limited and we are still testing, and this is a section that will be refined, but it's a first proposal, a first step. We have to be looking not just at the practices, but also at the outcome level. And you will find then the dashboards to allow you to visualize the key results of this assessment. And we can go next, please. If we look more specifically at the practice section, as I mentioned, there are 7 key dimensions that we developed, and they cover what we identify as the key the most important practices to be responsible in the agri and food system sector. The first dimension is really on strategy and accountability on responsible agriculture. And here we look more specifically at whether the agribusiness has a strategy on responsible business conduct and systems in place to implement this strategy. And we look also at whether the agribusiness tries to assess and manage its environmental and social risks and impacts. Dimension 2 is about inclusive and transparent structure. So here we look at transparent communication, consultation with stakeholders, especially before starting a new project. And we look at grievance management also. Is there any mechanisms to resolve complaints from the farmers, the local communities, or different stakeholders? In dimension 3, we look more specifically at the agricultural and food systems and operations. And more specifically, we look at food security and nutrition and food safety. So in terms of food security, it echoes a bit to what Darryl presented earlier in terms of what types of risks we are looking at. Dimension 4 is focusing more on the environmental dimension of the environmental sustainability of processes and products. So looking at environmental risks and sustainable practices that the agribusiness can implement. Dimension 5 looks at the responsible treatment of stakeholders. So here we look at tenure rights, cultural heritage, and fair contracting topics. I'm going very fast, but it's just to give you a first hint of what you can find in the tool. Dimension 6 is focusing on responsible human resource development, and here with a range of different responsible practices linked to HR management. And Dimension 7 is on financial transparency and benefit sharing. So looking at use of profits, transparency of the financial structure, etc. So you see, it's quite a comprehensive tool, quite a lot of topics that are covered here. And we can move to the next slide, yes. And for each of these dimensions, they are described into different key standards. Those standards themselves, the standards are broad statements, and those standards are specified into what we call essential practices. Those essential practices, then they are detailed as indicators, and some indicators go even more in details. So you have those different types of levels of details that you can find in order to be able to go to very concrete practices. Here you can see on my slide an example of what we talk about stakeholders' grievances. And we don't want to remain too broad, too general. So the tool is going to the detail that stakeholders should have the choice between at least 2 channels, with at least one of these channels being with live human interaction in order to be able to submit grievances or complaints. So this is very practical, as I say, and that's what can help agribusinesses if they identify a gap to build an action plan and say, okay, concretely, we are not doing that, and we see that's missing. It's a good practice. So that's something we can implement. Yeah. We can go next. I'm going very quickly here. You can have a look at the tool itself if you want more detail. But as I said, we provide this opportunity to filter in and out indicators based on the profile of the agribusiness. If we go next, in terms of scoring, usually for each indicator or detail, the answers can be yes, no, or partially. And with that, there's scoring related to the answer. We do not apply any weight to the different indicators because we don't want to give the impression that one practice is more important than another one. The purpose of the tool is really to allow agribusinesses to identify strengths and weaknesses, to identify the gaps, so with no ranking in between the different practices. And next, yeah, we have the dashboards where you can visualize, what's your score on each dimension or essential practice. And that allows you also very quickly to identify what you should address. So that was, I talked too much, I think, but that was a fast presentation of what the RAI tool is. And now I would say we would invite you to use it, to test it yourself. The RAI tool is available upon demand. And as Hafiz mentioned, we have also developed a guidance to help you apply the tool and a template report. And my last message to you would be, again, please keep in mind this should be seen as a management tool. So when you do the assessment exercise, try not to overestimate the scores, because if you overestimate, then you don't provide a sound analysis, and it's not helpful for the agribusiness to try to improve practices. So that's really what should be in mind. And I think you have the links here on that slide, and it will be shared with you to be able to contact us if you want to try to test the tool following this webinar. And
okay, thanks, Marrion. That was fantastic.
thank you,
A really
Hafiz.
good, very good overall assessment of what the tool is all about. And just to underscore this point, the final point, this is a management tool. It's actually to be able to improve how you do business in terms of RAI, rather in terms of a competition of scores. And we should really bear this in mind. And now finally over to our man on the ground, Duncan Pringle, or Agent Pringle as we call him.
Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks, Hafiz, and good day to all wherever you are. I had the fun bit of this work in that I got out into the field and was able to do the testing with a variety of agribusinesses and had the privilege of meeting some very interesting people and interesting organizations. I think just two things, two main messages I want to get across is firstly, just share with you the methodology that we adopted in terms of testing the tool. And then secondly, just share some perspectives of some of the outcomes, from the testing. So if we can move on to the first one. So our methodology, as you see on the left, followed a cascade from, selecting the agribusiness that we wanted to interview, through to gaining consent, and then all the way through to ultimately developing a series of case studies. On the selection, the impact investors that were participating in this study shared with us lists of investments that they had made, and a bit of a profile of each of the agribusinesses that they had invested in. And we selected companies, with a few principles in mind. Firstly, obviously trying to get one from each investor. Secondly, trying to get a wide geographic spread of agribusinesses, from West Africa through to Central East Africa, and then, as Hafiz touched on, with the cooperation with ASEAN, having a few interviews in the East as well. The other principle that we selected companies on the basis of a range of subsectors in terms of, early investment phase through to quite mature businesses. And then crop type or subsector type was also an important metric. And so again, we had a range of commodities, cocoa, rice, macadamias, avos, mangoes, coffee, is just to mention a few. The next phase was really just getting consent from the companies to do the piloting and testing with them. There's an introduction by the investors, explanations of what we're doing and how we were going to go about it, agreeing dates of interviews and the in-field research plan, and also taking always into account operational considerations in terms of timing of when we did the interviews. We selected initially for the tool itself, the Excel tool itself, we used online interviews in the main. It was just more time efficient and also enabled us, where available, to then interview different line managers responsible for those 7 different dimensions that Marrion mentioned. And this was then followed up with in-country visits, where we had agreed with the companies what sort of stakeholders would be appropriate for us to interview. These interviews being very much qualitative, because we're really looking for the living experience of entity stakeholders on their interactions with the company's policies and procedures, and what their opinions were. Back in the office, we were then able to triangulate between what management had given us as answers, as well as some of the qualitative feedback, from stakeholders. It allowed us also here and there to, go back and check on, on certain answers that we had got to get further details and context. I think most importantly, though, it enabled us in a practical sense to test the efficacy of the tool and give feedback to Marrion and her developers, just in terms of enhancements that could be made and improvements that could be made to the tool. And then finally, we've produced a series of case studies on the various companies that we interviewed. Some elected to have the results presented anonymously. Others were happy to have their company details included in the publications. We see that case studies as very much a resource available to those who want to engage with the tool, just to get a feel for some of the experiences that companies have had with the tool, and the sort of level of alignment with the principles. Those case studies are due for publication fairly imminently, so I think look out for those. Very briefly, we give a bit of context, country context to the business, and the subsector context. We discuss the business structure itself and what their key challenges are, and then also present the results from the tool, and then any recommendations to either the company itself, where it could close gaps, or other investors from the lessons learned, or even cases, some recommendations that government could consider. So moving on to the outcomes. Thanks, Maria. So the pilot testing was quite essential, as I've touched on, in terms of enhancing the tool. And some of the enhancements that were made over the process of testing it was what Marrion had touched on, and that was including a filtering system, because it is the tool itself, the questions, it's quite a long set of questions, but quite a few don't apply to different types of business or different subsector types. So it's really great to be able to have a system where you give a profile of the company, to answer key questions, apply the filter, and then you can get a shortened version of the questionnaire more appropriate to the entity that's using the tool. Obviously, we picked up a few gremlins, language not quite understood in questions, or slight duplications in questions between different dimensions, just being the same thing being asked in different ways. So we were able to clean that up. And then when you have a look at it, the dashboard graphics is a very ready and easy display, of the results, and certainly highly appreciated by, the managers. Once we showed them the results of the interview, that's really when the lights start to go on, when you can start identifying gaps and drilling down into specific enterprise practices or business practices where consideration could be given to developing a new action plan, policy, procedure, whatever. I think also, in general, agribusinesses found the tool understandable and easy to relate to, mainly because the language used in the questions is very much business orientated. So it's fairly easy for managers to understand it. There were some instances, especially with the smaller companies that we interviewed. Managers are very, very focused on just making the business work, and RAI is not necessarily front and center, of their thinking. It's very much getting the operational challenges sorted out and making the business work. So there is a need for more education, with smaller companies, and would certainly see a space for experts to be able to assist some of the smaller companies actually complete the interviews and the questionnaire. Possibly going forward as a later development for very micro businesses, one might consider, shortening the tool even more. In terms of challenges and limitations we experienced, as you would expect any work of this nature, the online interviews, some of them were a bit problematic with break in comms, but then again we were able to, with the in-country visits, able to then complete where the gaps were. It also wasn't a requirement in this testing to do a full assessment in the sense of actually requesting evidence of compliance. So you'll see in the questionnaire, there's the answer that you give to a particular question, yes, no, partial, or not applicable. But next to it, there's space where you can, record context, or you can record that there is evidence provided in terms of a policy document or a procedure document. So whether those were offered to us as evidence, we took them, but it wasn't a requirement to drill down rigorously into that aspect. There were some delays in terms of the testing because companies we had identified for one or other reason, weren't able to participate due to operational reasons or sale of a company in the middle of a sale transaction, so not suitable for them to get involved in testing. Thanks, Marrion. So continuing then, just with the last few points I'd like to share, is that managers generally found it very useful to identify gaps, their own alignment gaps with CFS RAI. And in fact, many of them found the process quite educational in terms of learning more about business practices, because questions that get asked pretty much point to a desirable business practice. And some, in fact, we're going to use the results of the scoring to motivate to their boards for improved support in things like examples were developing a more robust grievance redress policy, also more focused staff development programs, which obviously require financial resources to be committed. So they did find it useful in that sense. In terms of potential uses of the tool, as I experienced it, and as I said, it's a fairly easy tool to use if you have had a bit of exposure to RAI. I could see that some users would struggle a bit and would need the assistance of experts to guide them through the process. But certainly from a governance perspective, companies could do a self-assessment with or without the use of experts or consultants. Another case that we did test, which I found to be quite useful as well, and as Darryl mentioned, he's busy developing an early stage screening tool for investors and financiers to assess whether this business is worth going for. I think for more mature entities that have been in business for a while and there's a potential disposal, it could be possible, or the entity is wanting to raise finance. It would be possible from a desktop point of view on the basis of information supplied by a company to do a desktop screening using the tool as a guide to saying, does this business meet our minimum criteria for considering an investment or providing finance? And also identify gaps in knowledge that would be required to be filled by a more comprehensive due diligence exercise. And then finally, my last point really is also, I could see it as being used as a supplement to existing, formal ESG assessments and evaluations. So in conclusion, really a very useful tool, one that I would like to see being used quite widely, and to benefit companies in terms of developing policies and procedures that are aligned with RAI. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. That's great. I think you've highlighted some of the issues that arose while we were actually doing the field work and some of the solutions we found. But I think in the interest of time, we're going to move straight to Sean to the next stage.
Great. Thank you, Hafiz. And thank you to all the panelists, the speakers who've had a very unenviable task of trying to present in a very short amount of time a very, very rich piece of work that has many interesting components. I would just say that, of course, please, if something's not clear, we will have an opportunity to have some Q&A. But of course, even beyond this session today, feel free to reach out to ISD, to Cerise plus SPTF. We're very happy to talk more about this tool, explain it in more depth, go through it with you. So we really do invite that kind of engagement either today or as part of follow-up. I mentioned that we'll have some time for any questions. I did see a hand shoot up during the course of the discussions. Please feel free to raise your hands or to pop a question or a comment into the chat box. But before I do that, I mentioned earlier that this work, the development and the testing of the tool, has really been supported very strongly by the Swiss government, by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And we have with us today Christina Blanc from the permanent mission of Switzerland to the UN agencies in Rome. And Christina has been our focal point on a lot of this work. And I'd like to take a moment to invite Christina to take the floor and to reflect a little bit on why this work has been interesting and important for the Swiss, amongst others. So Christina, I think you have the ability to unmute yourself and to take the floor if you can. There you go. Yes, there you are. Hi, Christina.
Let's see. Yes. Thank you, Sean, and thanks, Hafiz, and all the colleagues that presented the work. For SDC or for Switzerland, we follow the RAI principle since a long time. Being part of the development process here in Rome of the CFS RAI principles, and then once the RAI principle that were endorsed, also to support their implementation. Because one thing that we believe it's important that we not only develop policy tool and policy guidelines in an inclusive manner, but also that we then contribute to their implementation, their use. And the point is, whatever we negotiate here in Rome, you have the member states, you have civil society, private sector being part of the negotiation, but the product as such, the policy recommendation or the principles, there we need an additional step in order to make them, to translate them to the users. And I think what we did and what we see now, or that was our intention, supporting IASD to promote or to help also governments and other actors to get a better understanding in their policy work. But on the other side, it's not only about government, but it's also, and here when it comes to responsible investment, especially also the private sector. And from a private sector perspective, when they see the wording what we as governments here produce in Rome, we really need to have actionable, practical tools that are adapted to the needs of the, in that case, of the stakeholders. And therefore, we are very happy to see that we have the tool now. And we also look forward to meet you again, hopefully in October at the CFS, where you also can present the tool to a broader audience at the CFS plenary session, because we think it's of utmost importance to really have something practical, that it's not only a burden for the users, but that it also adds some value and gives them some indication, not only what they could do better, but also hopefully not only to reduce the risk, but also at the long run to be more profitable. I mean, it's also, if we can include all, not only having the business case, but also taking into consideration environment and social issues, which are covered in the RAI tool. I believe that all this together will move us forward and towards a better achievement of the SDG. So it's not only about responsible investment in that context, but I think it's also in a broader sense. It's that the RAI principles are quite aligned also with the SDGs, which are global goals where all the stakeholders together should work towards to achieve them. So thanks a lot, and congratulations.